Please welcome a former member of the Knesset in State of Israel, Michal Cotler-Wunsh.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I thank the IRF 2022 Summit organizers for the incredible opportunity to participate and engage in this important forum on the topic of addressing rising anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, as an ancient, toxic, resilient virus, mutated over millennia in accordance with guiding social pillars or constructs of each century, from religion to race to nationality, now full cycle back to religion. It is the mainstreaming and normalization of this ancient hatred that is most alarming. For anti-Semitism is but a predictive example for other forms of hate and racism, rendering the tracking, understanding, and addressing of its unique mutation important not only for Jews or their nation-state Israel as a proverbial canary in the mine shaft, but for all concerned and committed to identify and combat all forms of hate and racism. The intersection between religion and universal values of human rights, developed as a secular religion, harbors the opportunity and responsibility for vital collaboration in the 21st century to identify and combat the appropriation and the weaponization of those universal principles for political ends. Such appropriation and weaponization undermine the very commitment of never again that the international rules-based order was intended to ensure and secure, even as instead we face, as we've heard, the devastating reality of again and again in Iran, in China, in Ukraine, etc. The mapping project of the greater Boston area, recently released by Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, BDS activists, provides anecdotal evidence demonstrating the viral, insidious mutation of anti-Semitism on and offline. I encourage you all to look it up in order to understand its dangers. The Liberation Map, as it's called, is not only an attack threatening Boston's Jewish community. Mapping the ties between Jews and the broader community, it invokes anti-Semitic tropes suggesting that there is something inherently insidious and sinister in Jews wanting to work with non-Jews. It constitutes an attack on foundational democratic principles of justice and freedom that should shock and concern all those cherishing them. Singling out Jews and those affiliated with them, the map rips open and exposes mutated forms of ancient wounds, hearkening to dark times in history, endangering Boston's Jewish community in the present day, and threatening the very foundations of American democracy. Possibly in an effort to mask outright anti-Semitism, in fact, exposing just how deep it runs, the map makers added an absurdly broad web of guilty by association allies. The threshold for inclusion on this list is very low. Any organization or public figure with even the slightest connection to Israel is tracked on the map. BDS has made no secret about its ultimate agenda, demonizing, delegitimizing, and singling out Israel with the ultimate goal of destroying it. In an Orwellian inversion, it appropriates universal values and rhetoric, weaponizing them against Israel, a law and human rights abiding state. This interactive map is but a recent, escalating, and visual manifestation of a clear and present danger. Many in the Boston community view this map for precisely what it is, an anti-Semitic hit list. This one example is replicated in a plethora of insidious manifestations on digital platforms and on the streets, echoing toxic anti-Semitic tropes as defined in the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA's working definition of anti-Semitism, the result of a long democratic process which includes the 3 Ds, namely the demonization, delegitimization, and double standards towards Israel. The troubling mainstreaming and ramifications of rising modern-day anti-Semitism in a digital reality expose the growing urgency to define ever-mutating new forms of an ancient hatred if we are to identify and combat its modern-day permeations. The trigger for the creation of the IHRA definition, a non-legally binding resource, was the 2001 Durban Conference against racism, the pretext for what became an anti-Semitic hate fest, systematically appropriating the language of human rights to conflate Israel with apartheid South Africa. A mutation of the 1975 Zionism is Racism UN resolution, revoked decades later. It is part of the recognition that where conventional warfare failed, a war for hearts and minds, implementing a systematic strategy can gain traction. With this as backdrop, the IHRA working definition has been adopted by hundreds of entities, countries, cities, sports leagues, corporations, universities. It clearly differentiates legitimate criticism of Israel, like any other country, from delegitimization of its very right to exist in any borders. It is those 3 Ds that enable the tracking of the mutation from traditional anti-Semitism that barred the individual Jew from having an equal place within society to its modern form, dedicated to barring the Jewish state from an equal place among the nations. Overt and direct messages sound alarm bells that must serve as a wake-up call to all who recognize that if a single group, minority, or religion cannot be protected, ultimately none can. This opportunity must be recognized by majority moderates who cherish foundational principles of justice and freedom that our ancestors could have only dreamed of, to ensure the IHRA definition is not only adopted by additional critical entities like social media giants, but that it is transparently implemented, taking responsibility to identify and combat rising anti-Semitism. The late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks instructed and inspired an understanding of the significance and strength of interfaith collaboration for each religion separately and for our shared values at a time of blurring morality, identities, and belonging. Moderate religious leadership of all faiths must use their power to influence, ensuring that religion is not hijacked to empower radical, extreme voices. In an echo chamber digital reality of outsourcing individual and collective memory and a struggle to find identity, faith offers a pathway to connection and belonging, recognizing that what makes the difference to our behavior is less what we do than the phenomenon of being reminded, even subconsciously, of what we believe. This requires faith leaders to rise to the challenge and sound voices of moral clarity, saying, "Not in God's name." Remembering that leadership is not about the leader, it is about how he or she builds the confidence of everyone else. That confidence, in Latin, is the word for having faith together. In conclusion, the toxic mutation of anti-Semitism, enabled by appropriation of the secular religion of human rights, undermines the international rules-based order they were intended to uphold, promote, and protect. The IHRA definition of anti-Semitism is a critical, comprehensive resource because to identify and combat rising anti-Semitism, it is imperative to first define it. The late Rabbi Sacks differentiated between optimism and hope, saying that optimism is the belief that things will get better. Hope is the belief that if we work hard enough, we can make things better. In that sense, optimism is quite a passive virtue, whereas hope is a very active one. It needs no courage to be an optimist, but great courage to hope. The national anthem of the State of Israel and the Jewish people is Hatikva, the hope. Thank you.